Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast live from Frontiers Health 2022. It is 5/22. The conference has just wrapped, and I am here with Web Editor Nicole Raleigh, Frontiers Steering Committee member Tony Estrella, thank you, and Kristin Milburn, Managing Director, Healthware Labs. I have brought these folks together to kind of review what we saw, what we heard over the last 2 days, and bring that to all of you. So thanks for joining me, guys.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
My pleasure.
This podcast will, unlike other podcasts, eventually be available also as a video on the pharmaphorum website, thanks to the crew here at Frontiers. So who wants to go first, sharing kind of big takeaways or impressions? What did you, I guess, hear the most? What are you going to go home on the plane thinking about?
I'll start just because I have the mic at my face first. I would say one thing I heard repeatedly, and including on 2 of the panels that I was moderating, is about, we have some DTX that have been proven to be effective. There've been clinical studies, and they're, shown to work for patients. The friction point to scaling seems to be the integration into the healthcare systems. So it's not just about building a great product and then trying to commercialize it. You need to do the work to integrate into the healthcare systems. And that means in Europe, particularly, that's country by country, region by region, depending on how that healthcare system is set up. And so I was also part of a session with the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, which is working. We're partnering with them, Healthware, to help try to harmonize the policy framework and help make that a little bit easier from the reimbursement side.
How did the meeting go?
It was interesting. We got some great feedback. Tony provided some great use cases and things to consider. I think it was, it's an ongoing project, and it's a lot to wrap your hands around because every country's in a different time. Obviously DIGA was the first. France is expected to be next, Belgium after that. But countries have also started to reimburse without even having a framework in place. And so they're all at different stages. But we all know it's going to be very hard to scale throughout Europe unless there's some kind of harmonization around the reimbursement pathway. So that's separate from the issue I brought up first, which is the actual integration into the healthcare system. Because getting reimbursed is one thing, but then how do you roll your product out? How do you integrate within the clinical pathway to get doctors to start to prescribe?
Let's stay on this for a minute. This idea of digital therapeutics, they're kind of here, they work, but now there's this whole second phase of really, how do we get adoption? How do we get scale? How do we get efficacy data? And anyone else have thoughts on that based on what they heard?
It's this question of having evidence and needing to get the evidence before you have the evidence. So having the practical, tangible results, as you were saying, Kristin, how do you get that without it being clinically used, clinically prescribed? How do you prove without the actual action of proving?
Yeah, and adding to that, I think it was Jeff Dawkins who said in one of the panels on day one that it's about the supply chain, and that the current supply chain right now is geared towards RX medicines. And it can't just assume that by adding a DTX into that supply chain, all of it's going to immediately be adopted. You have to go into each of the different stakeholders by looking at the individual and their adoption curve, the clinicians and their adoption curve, and insurers and how they will look at reimbursements to figure out how to bring this all together to create that ecosystem. And I would add to that, looking at it from the Asia lens, representing the Singapore and Asia contingent, that you also have to consider the out-of-pocket markets where insurance is not the default for how people should get their care. And so that was kind of one theme, is change in supply. And then another thing that came up in this conversation around DTX was, is DTX an avenue to help try to create and narrow the divide in health equity? Because it's just a new path for being able to provide treatments that have a different curve of cost for R&D, and therefore perhaps it's a way to be able to reach more people and bridge the access divide.
Right, which is always, of course, tricky because, yes, it's more scalable. Yes, we should be able to reach more people, but also you need access to these resources, you need broadband, you need a device, and let's make sure that as these modalities become mainstream, we don't leave people behind, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that came up, and you brought it up actually when we were talking about the policy frameworks and the fact that, that's what some of the policymakers are saying. Well, you're going to create more of a digital divide. If you get an infrastructure in place throughout the country so that everyone has access to Wi-Fi and you make it more accessible from a country standpoint, it's a push-pull, right?
Super interesting thing I heard. I think it was sort of came out of something on stage, but then sort of got developed in a discussion on the sideline. Was just this idea that, like, for a long time, digital therapeutics have looked to traditional therapeutics for their kind of benchmarks of legitimacy. So can we have an RCT like a traditional therapeutics? Can we be prescribed by a doctor like a traditional therapeutics? Now that they've kind of come into their own, some people are kind of questioning, well, just because this is the way it's done with drugs, does that mean it's the best way? So outgrowing that kind of need to just prove that digital therapeutics are therapeutics and standing on their own 2 feet and saying, okay, but the RCT doesn't really make sense so defined, exactly the way it did for drugs for digital therapeutics. So I thought that was another interesting take.
Yeah, there's definitely people pushing for more real-world evidence versus the true, like, RCT. But, I think that's what most feel comfortable with. Most, government agencies are more comfortable with what they've always done, right? So it's hard to get them to change that.
So what else? Good discussion around digital therapeutics. I'm sure we could do a whole podcast on that, but we're trying to do an overview.
Yeah.
I'll add a new topic then that, going to the nature of partnerships and looking specifically at how large global multinationals are looking and creating the avenues to partner with smaller startups. And what are the friction points and that exist and how to overcome that. So multiple organizations talked about this. On my panel where we talked about and explored about what's beyond video visits, we had Roche and then 2 different startups, Altibi and Prava Health. And we had that discussion. And then Pfizer had that in a session today through their innovation lab. And there was a few others who had this. And really it came down to 3 different points. Is that one, the velocity of how each organization operates, startup to global MNC, is different. And so there has to be some translation to come together to find a way to work together. Being able to create common milestones. Well, first common problem statements and then common milestones on how to address those changes. And then the third is trying to figure out how to be able to create the operational framework to go beyond pilots and really get to a level of scale that's meaningful, when you have to take into consideration that large organizations don't want to have 10,000 partners. They'd rather have 3. But then when you start looking country by country, can that same partner also work to solve this in multiple health systems? So there's a lot of questions that came up and some good examples of how it's being done on a limited basis today, but it is a roadmap that needs to be more filled out.
That's exactly the one I was going to say too, Tony. And I noticed it came up again and again today, right? I was in the Pfizer panel. Before that, I was in the VITA panel, and that's a startup accelerator that Healthware is involved in, and they were sort of talking about the same thing. How do we make these partnerships between startups and pharma? And then later in the day, your panel that you just hosted, Kristin, was about that, and we had Jacob Laporte from Novartis Biome. He was talking about a lot of the same things. So really seems very top of mind. And I had the insight while Jake was talking that the Novartis Biome system is so similar to that Pfizer Health Hub system. They're all kind of coalescing on this same sort of similar pipelines to find these startups, create the right kind of partnerships with them, and then, as you say, scale.
Yeah.
And scale can mean geographical, or it can mean scaling from one condition or disease indication into another, which is a huge undertaking, but so necessary because that everyone's over the point solution thing, right?
Absolutely. I heard that too. And I think it was interesting what Jacob was saying, and I know Pfizer works this way as well. They want to create ways to make it easier, to cut the bureaucracy, right, within the organization, even for a startup to interact with a big pharma. And the way the pharma is analyzing the startup is likewise thinking long-term, like how can this move beyond just the US or just whatever country popped up in. So I think they're getting smarter on both sides.
And I'll add one other example that came up was pharma is one category of company, but there's other healthcare organizations that are looking to create ecosystem-driven change. So putting infrastructure together internally to work from the very start with an external group. So Roche talked about Mission Leapfrog in the Philippines and Thailand, where the core team is half internal to Roche and half external to Roche. And it includes people who used to work in the public health system and policy making, and it includes external entrepreneurs. And so that group works together from the very start to define the solution. And it may not always lead to an additional incremental sale of a Roche product, but that's okay.
It's this concept of innovation within the system that exists. Sorry if I'm not waving my microphone in the correct direction. Yes, and going back to the word of scalability, this is something certainly that's sort of permeated the entire 2 days. I mean, I was listening earlier on mental health and how they're trying to scale up with regards to depression, the sort of incremental studies into psychedelics. I know it's a little bit out there, but it's still one option for depression, and potentially they were mentioning anorexia. So this scalability, this innovation within what exists, as you said with the Roche example in the Philippines, I was just speaking to Silvana Sinha earlier about Prava Health in Bangladesh, and it's just, can you tell me more about your thoughts on using what exists, say, in the first world, etc., going beyond taking what exists and making better healthcare there?
Yeah, I think her model is amazing in terms of what she's been able to put together. And for those of the audience who aren't familiar with Prava Health, they service 400,000 customers in Dhaka in Bangladesh for primary, secondary, and tertiary care with a clinical lab. And that's a pretty substantive organization that they've built out. And I think that they are an interesting channel, going back to linking DTX back into this, to bring innovative therapies to a lower income group to bridge that access divide, but really keep a focus on quality. So I think that was very nice. And I think the other thing that companies like Prava Health, Altibi, and other groups that focus on developing markets, there's a few others that came up, is the first session where we talked about H is for humanity, that the H in healthcare is for humanity. I was really happy I was honored that Roberto wanted to start the session with that focus on an element of humanity, and then to have it permeate through different sessions throughout the day and have people for day one and day two, and have people really say that was a nice way to really ground us as to why we're all here in the healthcare industry was also wonderful to see.
Yeah, I would second that. And I've been to a lot of these conferences, and it's not a normal thing to have that much space and focus dedicated to that kind of fundamental foundational idea that, like, while we're talking about this tech and it's the future and it's going to help people, let's also think about the people who don't even have access to the healthcare we have now, and how are we going to make sure they're included. So I think that's really, really good stuff. I want to talk about mental health a little bit. Nicole, you brought it up. We heard a lot of interesting stuff about mental health. And I want to frame this way. It used to be that people were very, very resistant, very almost defensive about the idea that a therapeutic or an app would ever take the place of a therapist or a counselor or a doctor. It used to be like the first thing was, here's what our app does, and the second thing is, don't worry, we're not going to give therapy just through an app. But I feel like that's starting to change. I mean, there's still that asterisk, but people are like, we don't have enough therapists, and the app's really good. So
that's it. There's just not enough therapists. I mean, I went through this in my own family. My daughter is a teenager, lived through COVID, in high school. Not easy on them. She had a lot of anxiety, and I asked friends, and even with video, tele health options, they're still like, those therapists are back to back to back every day. There's not enough. So I do think there is starting to be an opening. We heard from Monique from Wobot sharing how they're, how do they refer to the intelligent agent?
The relational agent.
The relational agent, and how people feel. And I've heard this before about how people become connected to robots. There's this, you start to get close to this person that's always there for you. And we've seen, research with seniors and the SEAL where they are, they put them in assisted living facilities and, it helps lower their heart rate. Like these are things that are here, and I think people are starting to get more open. And in some ways, it's the anonymity of interacting with a chatbot that, some people are very resistant to going to therapy to begin with. So not having a person there, I think is maybe opening the door for people that still have that stigma associated with therapy.
So good that stigma is, being washed away now with developments, and that we can have these discussions about mental health and developments therein to assist what seems to be an ever-growing problem.
And I'd add another point there is I also found it to be fascinating as to the levels of refinement as to what mental health means. And now there's different companies who are tackling different stages of what mental health challenges exist, from stress and anxiety through depression. So it's not viewed as one bucket anymore. As you can actually develop solutions which actually can be treated and hopefully end, but done in a way where it's very specific to that mental health need.
I do think we're overdue for the conversation about stewardship and responsibility. I know health publications or mainstream tech publications like to do these gotcha stories where they go to one of these agents and they type in "I want to kill myself" and then they report what they say. But I think there are, as this starts to become more commonplace, we are going to be facing more of these questions about what are the safeguards, what are the brakes on this train in case that the robot gets in over its head. And I think that's a fair question. One thing I heard, this wasn't related to mental health, but it seems like it could be one avenue for that, is Jalali from LTV was talking about how they use AI for quality control. And they have an AI listening to the calls their doctors do with the patients and just listening for anomalies. And then they have a human team so they can catch if a doctor isn't doing what they should be. And I wonder, it seems like that there could be something like that. AI could kind of monitor these conversations, but then at the same time, do you want your conversations with your therapist to be monitored? So it's tough.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think there is very good uses for machine learning and AI to help where monitoring is taking place. And as long as we're linking that monitoring to data privacy and creating the right standards and protection for cybersecurity around that, I guess the refinement of that question is, would you prefer having an AI listening or another human being listening who's not involved in the one-to-one discussion with your therapist? Most people would probably say, I'd rather have a machine listening because I want it to be private, but it remains to be seen.
Nicole, did you have any other that we haven't talked about yet?
While we're on the topic of AI, I just sort of wondered what you made, if you got to listen to it, to Robert Conrad's discussion of AI and using semantics and in that fashion connecting the dots in order to sort of develop their therapies. I thought that was fascinating. One of your questions, Jonah, for preparation for this discussion was, what did you find fascinating at Frontiers Health? And it is that sort of human linguistic element that is facilitating this. And I wonder, with us discussing AI listening to conversations in order to capture anomalies, this sort of bridge between all that, it just seems endless. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I didn't catch that session,
No,
but
right.
I get your point, and I think there's a lot that's going to be experimented with. It's still early days, but I think there's a lot of promise, right? I think there needs to be built-in safeguards, like you were talking about, but we're early days and.
Yeah, I think I didn't get to catch the session either, but one of the things around clinical research and new research and development in healthcare is, and you could argue that most of our healthcare history was around research as opposed to care and support. Really wasn't until we started having vaccines and then started having like physical facilities to help support everyone that we had more focus on care. And I think that is one area where it is good that healthcare moves a little slower in trying to not launch too quickly in areas like that where the technology has so many ways that it could go in unexpected ways. There are times where we want healthcare to move faster. This is one where it's probably a middle speed would be good.
Did everybody get to do the VR demo?
I have done it in the past, and it really is amazing how immersive It is. And so if I demoed the VR for pain solution, and what it's treating is chronic lower back pain. And what happens is people, even when they're, structurally or physically don't have the issue anymore, it's now something that they're scared of moving. And part of the therapy, the physical therapy, is movement. And so it's kinesiophobia, where you have a fear of movement. So when you put the VR headset on, you're transported into this other place, and it gives you these exercises to do through this, different, like a cabin in the woods and, near a waterfall. And so you're not thinking about what you're doing. It's asking you to do things within this world. And so it's really immersive, and you really feel different when you take it off, And so I am really excited about that. I mean, I have a cousin that died of an overdose on opioids, and it tears me up that he could have had a solution like this to work through his back pain. And, we lost him too soon. I mean, it's tragic. But so I think there's a lot of promise for the pain specifically, use of VR. And then I think it's going to move to other therapeutic areas where physical therapy could be a good modality. So yeah, I'm excited about that.
Just to tie these two threads together a little bit, they also introduced Sammy, which is a animated character in the virtual world who sort of acts as not as a therapist, but is the voice of the program and helps coax people to doing
guiding you
their
through
physical therapy.
Yeah.
So he's real cute. I'm eager to see him in action.
Yeah. No, that was a new thing they added. They learned that in the first trial that they needed to have some kind of someone walking you through it. So they created Sammy, which is a little avatar. It's kind of fun, but it kind of guides you through your exercises. So yeah, it kind of gets almost like it's a chat bot, but it's live.
A guiding light of hope indeed. Yeah.
We've got just a few minutes left. I'm sure we haven't scratched the surface, but anything else standing out, burning for people they want to talk about?
Well, I'll say one thing. I mean, there was a lot of questions about the economic downturn, and is that going to have an impact on, innovation? And, from what I heard from some of the VCs on the various panels is they don't think so, but they do think startups are going to need to be more judicious, stick to the basics, double down, and get through this. There may be more acquisitions of startups from, larger corporates, potentially mergers. But in general, that they felt, even though there's less money that's flowing into, we all saw the stats of, what happened this year versus the frothy years of the pandemic, that, it's not going away. It may slow down a little bit, but it's still, they don't think the bubble has burst.
Yeah, and I heard a couple of other comments along those lines, which is more mergers of startups so that you get a more robust platform coming together. And obviously there's complications in that in terms of how do you operationalize it, but maybe too many companies right now, not enough capital. Yes. So that was one solution that was suggested by one of the investor panels. And then I think a second thing that didn't come up in this conference on a stage, but I heard it just walking around, is that fundraising for funds is also a challenge. So they also have to do their own fundraising elements. So I think that one's, especially for earlier funds, if you're a fund that has not yet cracked 100 million in assets under management, it's a harder fundraising environment now versus before the war started.
Yeah, I did think, obviously not a rosy picture for funding right now, but rosier than I was expecting going into the conference.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, like maybe some of those funds are having a hard time, but then you have the corporate VC funds that still have a lot of money. In fact, one launched just here, Angelini Ventures, which is a $300 million fund, actively meeting with startups here. And so, yeah, I think the corporate VCs might be in a better position right now.
Yeah, and tying back to an earlier point of discussion, I think one of the reasons that those pharma partnerships are so coveted with startups right now, everyone wants to it provides a layer of security, to have that relationship and eventually maybe to try to get acquired by that pharma company you've been partnering with, which happens somewhat regularly.
Yep. More stability for sure if they can show that they've had traction with a large company, which they know would have a lot of hoops to jump through in order to sign that partnership, right?
So should we end with a lightning round? Maybe just the most interesting thing you heard, best quote that you heard, best moment at Frontiers, however you want to take it.
Yeah, I heard a great quote from Helene from at the farm, and she said she heard it somewhere, so I'm just going to pass it along, which was, U.S. innovates, EU regulates. And I just thought it was kind of funny because maybe, the U.S. way of growth at all costs is not the best way. And we need a little bit of pullback, which they are now, which the EU is doing with the tech companies. But I just thought that was a funny,
very pithy
comment.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the takeaway has been it's from mistakes that change happens. You cannot get anywhere without failing. Failure is a must.
I would say, actually, the panel I just came from, Theo Adehome from Wealthy, he said, first of all, patient engagement trumps patient activation every time. And then he was explaining the difference between the two, and he said, patient activation is getting the patient to do what you want. Patient engagement is supporting the patient in doing what they want.
I know, that was great. I thought that was a really well said.
I've never heard it put that way before in all the time I've been covering this space, but it really, when you think about things like medication adherence, you really see how that kind of perspective shift can be really valuable.
And for me, I go back to Lena Chandra's opening when she described the story of the child and being the parent taking the child around and having to go to 7 different hospitals after being rejected from 6 because they just couldn't pay for healthcare. And it was just a story that touched everyone's hearts, because I just still, to me, I can still hear the applause from the audience.
I just got the
her
chills
story.
again, just thinking about it, how horrifying that was. And it's an apt way to end this discussion, because it's the way this conference started, and it's what really matters is making sure that doesn't happen.
I agree.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
At the end of that talk, Tony, you kind of issued a challenge to people meeting at the halls of the conference, asking, start your conversations by talking about why you're in healthcare, what this means to you. And I really like that too. And hopefully that really did inform people's experiences over the last 2 days.
I hope so, and I hope we continue doing that in our future. We interact with new people across the industry to keep that focus on humanity.
Well, thank you guys all for joining me here at the end of the show. Thank you all for tuning in and listening. Safe travels home.
Thank you. Yeah.
Ciao.
Till 2023.
That concludes this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series, at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at pharmaphorum. Thanks for listening.